thinking that I won't react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying danger in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round. Oh, 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 yeah. First round, fifth round, final round. No, 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 no. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, oh, oh,
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter, and with me today is Xandring, and we are here to discuss, I don't know if developments is the appropriate word, but not developments, I suppose, in our understanding, but at least the developments in what people are saying about the origins of COVID-19. Now, when COVID first came out, it was discovered that it came out in the Wuhan area, and it turned out that there was a lab there. A lot of rumors, speculation. Is it a weapons lab? It certainly was working with viruses and stuff like that. And so did it come from the lab? Was this deliberate? Was this? And everybody was asking all sorts of questions. And conspiracy theories reigned. Everybody was terrified. And the general consensus after all that time from the World Health Organization and scientists in the U.S. was that this developed naturally and that this was not a release from that lab. For the most part, that has roughly put an end to it until about, I think it was 2 or 3 days ago. The Department of Energy, of all departments, came out and essentially said that they believed that it had actually come from that lab. Now, why the Department of Energy has suddenly decided to opine is an interesting question that I think we're going to get into. They also said that they had low confidence in this, and we're going to go over the confidence measures, but why, if they have low confidence, they're releasing it is another question. And as we were trying to ponder these, the head of the FBI went on to Fox News, which may not have been the wisest choice if you're trying to get a message across accurately, and said a phrase that was hedged so many times I had no idea what he was actually trying to say, but something along the lines of that they believed that it was possible that there had been a possible, I think he used the word possible twice. I will look up the actual statement. We've got it, because it's important to quote that accurately. Fox News actually played the entire statement as he had said it, so they did that well, and then all the pundits came on and said, well, there you go, the FBI has declared that it came from the lab in Wuhan. So, Fox News is gonna Fox News. Why would the FBI director go on Fox News? I think we're going to discuss that one as well. But this has reignited the questions about where did it come from? If it came from a lab, why has it taken so long to reach that consensus? If not, why are we discussing it now, and why is it such an issue? And with the Chinese spy/weather balloons, with China now entering Ukraine, this has become suddenly a political hot potato because there are now questions of, is someone trying to make China look bad? Is the U.S. trying to use this as leverage? China is accusing the U.S. of all of these things. Before we begin, and we'll bring out Homozygoat in a minute, I want to make you aware of a couple of things, and we'll set some ground rules that everybody seems to have agreed to. Why the Department of Energy? We don't know why the Department of Energy, but the Department of Energy is one of 18 organizations in the so-called intelligence community, which is under the umbrella of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Why is the Department of Energy involved in intelligence at all? And they have a both intelligence operation and a counterintelligence operation at the Department of Energy. Very simple. Nuclear power falls under the Department of Energy. Even if it didn't, energy independence, energy security is obviously very important. Germany has reminded us of that during the Ukraine war, and so it is necessarily a part of the intelligence community. It does not normally deal with the origin of viruses. We'll talk about what they've said and what has been said after that. He used 2 words: plausible, that it was possible, that it was plausible. I think he had said it was, thank you, Porpoise. I think he had said something, I'm going to find the statement. He had said something along the lines of, it's possible that it was plausibly leaked from something along those lines. It was astonishing. At any rate, we're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss everything, but, now you should have all the background, so let us bring out our guest. Once again, Homozygoat. Sir, how are you?
Staying warm, and I guess fending off the hordes of people who think they are now the best understanders of science in the whole world after this DOE report. That's been pretty much my life the past couple of days. It's just people are screaming about this incessantly, so I have to tell them to take a chill pill and read some science.
The number of people I have to explain the science to is just, it's amazing. It gets me every time. I know exactly how you feel, minus the PhD stuff. All right. And so are you a student of science? Is this a hobby? What's your background?
Yeah, so currently I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at the University of Vermont. I have a bachelor's and a master's in microbiology. I pretty much have 2 degrees worth of training in the background of infectious diseases. Currently, I'm in a cellular and molecular biology program, so that's a pretty big umbrella program that's very biochemistry and cell signaling focused. So I have a pretty in-depth understanding of all the molecular stuff that has been going on, not only with COVID, but with the pandemic in general, and with some of the future germs that we might be seeing pandemics from. My skill set really affords me the ability to sit down and analyze these things for what they are, separately from mainstream media narratives. So that's where I'm coming at this from.
And we've had you on multiple times. It's always a delight to have you on. Speaking of, is Andring, if I do forget, if you could make sure we'll ask him very briefly. I don't want to do a whole show on the H5N1, but while we've got him, maybe ask him 5-10 minutes at the end of the show, just to elucidate on that a little bit. So please, as Andring, if I forget, remind us and or remind him or ask him, and we'll get that done. Because I think that's also making news. But I do want to do this show primarily on the Wuhan issue. Now, there are a couple of things that, and so there's these 18 departments that I spoke of, all under the umbrella of national intelligence, and 16 of them came out and said that they believed that this had come out just sort of naturally and was not from a lab. I think it was 2 that had said, there's no conclusive evidence either way. We're not going to opine on it now. There's been some opinions given. So one of the things that all of them agree on, so all of the U.S. intelligence agencies agree, 1, the virus was not developed as a biological weapon. So we're taking that off the table in terms of anything we're going to discuss. That seems to not be at issue. 2, that it was not genetically engineered. There were actually 2 agencies, again, that have held out an opinion on that, but all of the other 16 have said it was not genetically engineered. Maybe we'll touch on it, but that seems to not be at issue for anyone. 3, that Chinese officials did not have any foreknowledge of the virus. So if it had come from a lab, it was an accidental release. It was not anything deliberately done by the Chinese. They were caught completely unprepared, and this is apparent just by looking at it, but it's also our intelligence agencies by observing, however it is that they have intelligence on the internal machinations of China, believe that this caught them completely by surprise. So none of these issues are contested. So I think we will put those away and not discuss those unless for some reason they come up. But I'd like to, at least where there's agreement, get that sorted. Does that sound reasonable to everybody here?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting, like, with respect to the intelligence agencies, I mean, the Department of Energy does have, like, actual biolabs. So, they're not just, purveyors of, like, the nuclear stockpile or energy infrastructure. I mean, they do have some degree of biological research capacity, and they have made, good contributions towards pandemic efforts since the pandemic began. So it's not like they're just some, like, random entity that's being lumped in with intelligence organizations. I mean, they do have like biologists, I'm sure probably microbiologists, maybe even some virologists like on staff. So we're not just talking about a bunch of like Rick Perry's making claims based on spying or anything like that. I think they have at least some degree of biology based knowledge, and that's worth noting. I would say in contrast to that, most of the contemporary like scientists are academics at universities and not coming from the Department of Energy. So most of the scientists involved in the conversation aren't necessarily coming from the DOE. It's either going to be, university laboratories or NIH scientists. Those are going to be like the 2 groups of scientists you'll hear the most from.
All right, thank you. And then, real quick, then that reminds me, and the FBI also, and the director of the FBI was quick to point out that they also have those facilities and scientists at the FBI, and that those were utilized There were some questions about, well, wait a minute, aren't you contradicting the science? And we'll get into that in a second, but the FBI also has those kinds of facilities. Sinister Porpoise, wait until we hit my recursive COVID-19 routine. I don't want to be here for that. I really don't want to be here for that. We've had enough. I've had enough with pandemics to last a very, very long time. But thanks for the offer. All right, so why don't we start at the beginning, which I think is going to be a couple of days ago. So, just out of curiosity, just on a sort of a personal level, so you're sitting there doing your thing, you're studying, working, and then you hear that the Department of Energy has come out with this. What was your first thought, and how did you approach it from there?
My first thought in particular was, this shit again, really? We're coming back to this. So, I took a look at who was on the authorship, like the author byline of that Wall Street Journal piece, and a particular name stuck out to me, and that name was Michael R. Gordon. Anybody who has really kept up with their history will remember that name for a very infamous 2002 New York Times piece about whether Saddam Hussein was acquiring atomic bomb parts to ultimately manufacture consent for the war in Iraq. It was Michael Gordon and Judith Miller were the two authors of that piece, and it was later revealed 2 years later, after the war had begun, the information in that article was lies fed to them by none other than Dick Cheney. So Michael Gordon somehow managed to get off scot-free, didn't take the fall for that. Judith Miller really had their career ended because of that piece, but Michael Gordon just slipped below detection on the radar. And since then, he has been a very close mouthpiece with the U.S. State Department. So my first reaction was, oh, look, it's this guy again here to sow some anti-Chinese sentiment. And this is all coming off the heels of Spy Balloon Gate, where we had to scramble a bunch of jets for balloons, in the atmosphere. So the timing of this felt very much aligned with the current anti-Chinese furor, regardless of what the contents were. I immediately saw the author and I said, okay, this is probably not credible. Then I went and double checked just to make sure I wasn't misremembering anything. And Michael Gordon wrote a very similar piece about the COVID lab leak in 2021, which then backed up my notion of this shit again, because he literally did this 2 years ago when there were claims from anonymous sources from the intelligence agencies that maybe possibly some people who worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that couldn't be named were perhaps sick with something kind of cold-like, maybe, perhaps, when COVID started. And that was the whole rigmarole that prompted Joe Biden to get the intelligence agencies more involved in the first place, and said, hey, you have 90 days to provide me a report and your assessment as to whether or not this came from a laboratory and how credible this information was. And surprise, none of them came back with anything new. They all basically said, we're shrugging our shoulders, we really don't know. So Michael Gordon has now been responsible for not one, but two media cycles of the whole COVID lab leak thing. And in both iterations of this, there has never been any new evidence that's been released, published in a paper, published in a peer-reviewed journal, even released to Wall Street Journal, other mainstream media outlets. There's no credible sources, no new data, no new evidence. And my first reaction is, okay, look, if nobody's publishing anything, if we have nothing new, why are we talking about this? Literally nothing new has been stated. We have anonymous sources from the Department of Energy who made a low confidence. It definitely came from a laboratory assessment, which is a contradiction. And we're here now talking about it because it seems like some people really want us to talk about it rather than we actually had any new revelations. So that was really my mindset, my headspace when I first heard about this. It was just like, oh, great, we're doing this again. All right, time to buckle up and get the science out again so I can throw it at people.
Well, and then of course a day and a half later, the head of the FBI, who, in my view, I usually think of as reasonably credible, went on Fox News, which admittedly, in my view, did some damage to his credibility, and came out and basically said that the FBI has had that view for some time, and that was their conclusion, was that it had most likely come from a lab. I think it was probably had most likely come from a lab or something along those lines. And the FBI shortly came out on Twitter, because apparently that's now how we make official releases, and confirmed that, in fact, he was speaking for the FBI when he said that. Which was my first question. Is he drunk, or is he go, no, okay, he's speaking for the FBI. So the FBI has confirmed that is their view. So what then?
Well, you know what, that at this point, like, if the FBI director is going to talk about this, then he needs to put up or shut up. Like, there's no new published data. He didn't say, like, our scientists are, submitting a letter to the editor for the New England Journal of Medicine or Science, like the journal, or anything. Like, we didn't get any new information. He just said, yeah, this is what we think. It's like, okay, well, you can think that. I would still say you're just completely wrong, but you're entitled to be wrong, I suppose. Like, there's nothing new that he had to say. So his presence on Fox News to me was very much in that same vein of, we're here to manufacture consent and anti-Chinese sentiment to, get people riled up and, stoke the flames of conflict. I don't know if that is necessarily intended to be a military conflict or some sort of asymmetric, warfare or sanctioning of China. I mean, I'm not really sure what the end point of this is, or as opposed to, like, just getting people to hate China more or something. Like, all of this is just built up to China bad, and this is why it seems so futile to talk about, because it's like, this isn't productive. So if the FBI director is willing to go on Fox and be completely unproductive, then I'm willing to just dismiss what he has to say if he can't provide any evidence. Like, that which is presented without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. So that was my attitude towards what the FBI director had to say, but he didn't say anything new, so I really don't care.
His exact quote, and I would like people to listen to this very carefully. His exact quote was, quote, "The FBI has, for quite some time now, assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab leak in Wuhan." So it is most likely a potential lab leak. I don't know what those sentences mean when put together that way. Are those words?
That's equivocating language. Like, that's a very big tell that, like, if they're not saying this with any degree of, like, firm certainty that, well, maybe it's a potential lab leak, and we've felt very strongly it's a possible lab leak. Like, okay, that's not new information. That's just you restating your opinion. So, like, if you want to have vibes on Fox News where you think things might happen, okay, cool. That doesn't change anything. That doesn't change material reality. So,
and there's a high possibility of a great many things being potential. I mean, it's just like almost everything is a potential. I mean, there's a high probability that there was a potential second shooter on the grassy knoll. Okay. I'm sorry. I just from somebody who presumably is educated and knows what he's in law enforcement. Okay. I'll try not to get too triggered. All right. So, why do scientists say that this did not? I mean, how are you going to tell? Just out of curiosity, actually, let's quickly, even though we buried this at the beginning, how do they know it wasn't engineered?
Well, there are a couple of features, I guess we'll have to dip into the molecular biology a little bit. Right at the very beginning of the pandemic, there are emails actually to show this between Fauci and a bunch of other academics, where they looked at the sequence of the virus for the very first time in, like, January, February of 2020, and were like, well, wait a second, like, some of these features seem a little suspicious. Like, why is this thing called the furin cleavage site a feature that makes the virus more infectious? Why is this present inside of the virus in the first place? That it reeks. So what they did was actually engage in the scientific method. They sat down, analyzed the sequence of the virus more, like, did some digging in the established literature about coronaviruses in particular, and they said, well, you know what, like, there's the version of this feature that's put into the virus, it's kind of shitty, and a scientist put it in backwards if they actually put it in, which a good scientist wouldn't actually do. So, like, this is definitely not something that was bioengineered. Like, if this is a bioweapon, it was one of the world's worst bioweapons, and quite frankly, I think whatever scientist did it, if they actually did do it, should be fired because it sucks. So that's essentially their conclusion, is that, like, this is so crappy, it has the hallmark of being a sloppy product of nature rather than something that a scientist did on purpose. So they engaged in the scientific method. They had a hypothesis that it was possibly bioengineered. They looked at the literature, they looked at data, and they changed their mind. So they had new information that changed their disposition, and that's a very proper way of going about a scientific evaluation of things. So they ruled out bioengineering of a bioweapon that way very early in 2020.
And again, that has been now ruled out by every intelligence organization that I'm aware of in the U.S., I haven't heard any intelligence anywhere, World Health Organization, anyone in the UK, anyone anywhere saying otherwise. So that's one at least everybody agrees on. How on earth can you tell whether or not something was out in the wild, bats, whatever, or a scientist comes, grabs a bat, brings it into the laboratory just to study? They're studying the virus and then somehow release it from inside the laboratory.
Yeah, so if we're addressing the first part of that, like how do we know these things come from nature? Well, number one, we have precedent with SARS-1 in 2003, right? Science, it took a pretty decent amount of time to actually find the intermediates, the animals that harbored SARS-CoV-1, and that took about 14 years. They actually found the progenitor viruses that likely combined together to form SARS-1 14 years after that started, and they found it in the 𝗲𝗲𝐻 cat, a factory-farmed animal in the Chinese wilderness, so to speak. So first we have precedent that tells us like this is a thing that happens a bunch. With other non-coronavirus germs like animal spillover, zoonoses, that has a very, very large historical precedent. Flu viruses in particular are a very big contemporary zoonotic disease that we will probably talk about a little bit towards the end of this segment. Mm-hmm. So this is something that's not far-fetched. Now, if we're talking about SARS-CoV-2 in particular, there are viruses in the Chinese wilderness that are coronaviruses that have been collected from bats over time, and that was the work being done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It was a preventative work to try and prevent another SARS, like the one in 2003, from happening. So with that being said, they had a actually pretty rich library of coronaviruses that they collected from bats in nature. Like they went out into caves and swabbed the butthole of a bat to find these things. So they have a pretty big library, and when the pandemic actually first started, they thought, like the actual researchers there thought that, oh God, did it come from our laboratory? And then they tested every single virus they had in their laboratory and said, oh, none of these are close enough in relation to be SARS-CoV-2. So thankfully, it didn't come from there for that purpose, or for because of that laboratory. So we know really, and there's other defenses of the Wuhan Institute of Virology I'll get to, but if we're talking about the actual viruses themselves, no progenitor of the virus, no version of SARS-CoV-2 itself was ever present in that laboratory. That was tested very early on, and they had published the sequences of these viruses for years prior to COVID. So if they had it, we would know. That's where the conspiracy starts coming into play, and that's where people start saying, well, maybe they had a super secret freezer that they didn't test and it's hiding in there. So all that to say, between the molecular features that have the hallmark of evolution and nature, and the fact that they actually tested every virus in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and it wasn't related to SARS-CoV-2, wasn't close enough of a relative to actually have any degree of connectedness. Nature, zoonotic spillover, is the only thing that remains. I think the remainder of the discussion will probably talk about the wild series of assumptions that would have to make a lab leak true in the context of that laboratory across the river.
Well, I do want to also make sure, so as Andering, I wanted to give you a chance, assuming I am hoping I haven't asked all your questions. I can think of a few myself, so I'm hoping that you've got a few, and wanted to know if you had any questions for Homozygoat. All right, I'll ask the questions. So coming from Xandering, why is my co-host Nick just such a brilliant human being? And do you like being on the show a lot, or do you love it?
And I totally hate it.
It's back. Oh, Xandering, you're back. Just piece of advice: don't lose your microphone. Don't lose your microphone when I have control of it, because I was giving Homozygoat a hard time before that we started because he didn't have audio, and now it's okay. All right, so Xandering, I was wondering if you had any questions you wanted to ask.
The really kind of important ones you've asked, we're about to go over kind of, what kind of assumptions do we have to make in order for it to actually be a lab leak, which is another one. That's why I'm interested in that, but so we were going to go over that in a minute. I think we should maybe call a spade a spade. This has been a whole bunch of damn drama. It's not developing news. It's just drama. And I don't quite know why news agencies are engaging in this. So I don't want that from my news agencies. I want news from my news agencies, not drama. But holy crap, I'm a little shocked at how much this blew up. Why do you think that this blew up so much? I mean, no new information, it sounds like, was really provided. Now is it just a bunch of people that had a conspiracy theory that wasn't really borne out, and then suddenly they're grasping at anything to say, aha, look, we were right, you were covering it up? Or why do you think this blew up so much just recently?
The last part,
the biologist about sociology, sorry, but
well, no, sociology is kind of an important component to put the biology in the context of society. I mean, it's important to sort of look at the intersectionality and relatedness of these things. So I think that's actually a really good question. I think it really, for the average person, especially the average believer of the lab leak, it definitely hinges upon the whole this is a conspiracy theory that I've believed in for so long, and they feel like it's validated because one intelligence agency maybe had a low confidence assessment with no new information. Like they don't have the totality of the scientific knowledge to say oh, okay, this is something that's actually been really functionally ruled out a pretty long time ago, like summer of last year. People just have kind of been ignoring the science, and it feels very gaslighty in a way. I think for the average person, that's what's going to most resonate for them, is a validation. Finally, the intelligence agencies agree with me, and they know everything because they're spies and they're good at spycraft. In reality, the media amplifying this, right, to address the former part of this, the media amplifying this is really an opportunity for them to engage in the concept of manufacturing consent, to try and drum up the anti-Chinese sentiment, the anti-Chinese government sentiment in the hearts and minds of Americans. I mean, this is something that's happened on and off throughout the course of history to justify all sorts of military conflict. I think one that sticks out is, again, the war in Iraq, and they are literally busting out the same dude who did it before in 2002 to do it again. So, I don't know what the nature of said conflict would look like, but considering we're dealing with a reporter who has close ties to the American State Department, it's unsurprising for me to see his name on the byline. It's unsurprising that the media is going to amplify this and shout it from the high heavens, because this is their job, right? This is what they are functionally there for. All right, they're supposed to be reporting news, but they'll happily report unsubstantiated drama if it gets people riled up.
So we have
makes sense.
Real quick, super chat from Sinister Porpoise, and I actually moved to we do the peer review, which is Greg, who we've also had on a couple of times, has a question, and let's make sure we get to it. I don't want to do it just yet. I want Xandering to have more time. But does the recent SARS COVID-2 variants tell us anything about the initial outbreak? So we'll want to make sure we get to that. Sinister Porpoise said, I've noted a severe lack of reading comprehension on the right and believe a fair number don't understand the word probable. But that was not the super chat, so let me go hit the super chat real quick. Apologies for Just needing a moment, and then I'd like to make sure we hit that back to. Sinister Porpoise, $2. You mean Fox News is not a scientific journal?
Shocker.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
That is. I mean, that just destroys my worldview.
Pew Research found that of all of the news organizations in the mainstream media, the most uneducated to what actual facts are the viewers of Fox News by a significant margin. So we'll have to put that study back up, but that was another one. All right. So anyways, please, Andrew, continue.
Well, my next thing that I really want to know is, to kind of lay out the evidence as to why it's unlikely to have been a lab leak.
Yeah, we can get into that. There are two publications that were actually peer reviewed and published in the journal Science summer of last year. Really clever detective work to actually do this with the available information and actually tease out some additional information underneath the nose of the Chinese government to reach these conclusions. Ultimately, what this boils down to is the fact that two separate genetic lineages of the virus, which are termed lineage A and lineage B, these two different lineages of the very first version of the virus emerged in the seafood market 2 weeks apart. So if we're to talk about a lab leak situation, what would have had to have happened if we're talking about an accidental or even a deliberate bioweapon release? What would have had to have happened is a worker at the Wuhan Institute of Virology would have had to get sick, knowingly have the virus, knowingly think, oh, I'm sick, and then go to the Huanan seafood market 21 kilometers away across the river, driving over a bridge to get there, only to spit and cough on everyone on purpose. Then 2 weeks later, another worker in the laboratory would have to have the same thing happen, but with a different genetic lineage of the virus, and then drive that 21 kilometers and then cough and spit all over everybody. And if we're talking about the likelihood of a laboratory worker wanting to go to that market, some of the data in this paper actually looked at social media check-ins on Chinese social media in Wuhan, and that seafood market is one of the least trafficked areas of the entire city and even of the entire province of Hubei. So it's not like the seafood market was just like a super spreader, right? That's a very common talking point from the lab leak people. As they say, well, yeah, this is the first big human amplification event, and the virus might have come from somewhere else because we only sampled all of the people in Wuhan because those are the first people getting sick because it was a super spreader, and you don't know that the virus wasn't elsewhere, but they would have known because people getting sick with a new pneumonia of unknown origin, that was only happening in Wuhan. That's why all of the hospitals in Wuhan were the ones with the cases. And surprise, when they figured out where all these people went, it was the market. So there were two separate genetic lineages that emerged at the market 2 weeks apart. The virus was only originating from the market and not anywhere else because the actual corroboration of case data at the very beginning says everybody who was sick initially had links to the market, and all of the cases that they saw that did not have links to the market in terms of the geography, they radiate outwards from the market in a bullseye shape. So that wouldn't have happened if you had something coming out from a laboratory. Like, you wouldn't have everything centering so profoundly on that market and radiating outwards from there. And quite frankly, there's almost a reason to say they got lucky, because if the first emergence of these viruses happened somewhere else that was a lot more highly trafficked, this would have taken off a lot quicker. The final thing that we can really say is that at said market, we saw in these papers not only literal photographs, but also testing of the physical market spaces where animals that were factory farmed for fur were stored in the market and sold at the market. It's the southwest corner of that market where animals that have been experimentally proven to harbor the virus asymptomatically were kept and sold for their fur at the market. They actually tested the cages where those animals were, the countertops, like the tables, and surprise, the greater amount of surfaces that tested positive for the virus in the entire market all concentrate right where those animals were. So there's a pretty simple and straightforward pathway from somebody going out into the wilderness, getting an intermediate animal and keeping it in captivity in close quarters, and for the virus to jump from one animal to all the animals, and then once all of those animals are in the market, to jump to people. Right? It's not a very far-fetched thing. There's a lot fewer assumptions when we're talking about that compared to, a laboratory worker would have had to have timed 2 separate genetic lineage emergences in the laboratory and then go to a place that very few people go to spit and cough on everybody. Right? None of that really tracks with the incubation period of the virus at that time being like 5 to 7 days. Right? This wouldn't have actually made any sense if we're talking about a lab leak scenario. And that's why, in a nutshell, why a lab leak was kind of functionally ruled out. And that's the verbiage that I actually used, right? The only evidence that would change that disposition that a lot of scientists have, including myself, the only evidence that would change our mind is if they had some sort of confirmed proof that they actually did have a version of COVID in the laboratory or a progenitor virus in that laboratory, which they did not. And even to top that off, all the workers at the laboratory were actually tested for coronavirus exposure. They had their blood tested to see if they had any antibodies raised against the virus, and every single one of them was negative. So, that's a pretty clear-cut piece of molecular evidence that if a laboratory leak happened, right, that necessitates one of the workers being sick. All the workers tested negative. So, I could go on. I could probably recite half the contents of these papers by heart, but go ahead.
I do want to clarify 2 things, or touch on 2 things, because I've heard these as well. Possible.
You're roboting. Oh, there you are.
Is everything working okay now?
Yep, we got you.
Yeah, better.
How dare people actually call me in the middle of me doing a show? Jeez.
Oh, God.
So 2 of the things that I want to touch on, because I've heard of them. Is it possible that the virus could have gotten out of the lab without somebody having been infected, say contaminated clothing or contaminated materials of any way?
And if we're talking about surface transmission, technically possible, but highly, highly improbable since this is an airborne virus. Surface transmission has not been a significant contributor to COVID spread throughout the entirety of the pandemic, both from start to finish. Any of the debate about how the virus was transmitted that happened in the scientific community was a debate between droplets and aerosols, and both of those necessitate being in the air rather than by surface. Right? One is just short range, and the other one is long range. So that's very, very highly unlikely that it would have gotten out on somebody's clothes. Whether or not somebody had it asymptomatically, that is also possible, but again, that wouldn't track with how the cases around the market developed in the very beginning, because there are 2 separate lineages that emerged 2 weeks apart. So it would be. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and then the next thing is it possible? And I've heard this so many times now. Even I've had to question that. But is it possible that it could have started as one? You said they were emerged 2 weeks apart. Is it possible that one could have evolved from the other rapidly, like right off the bat had a mutation, or are they 2 genetically different?
So, the short answer is that they're 2 genetically different. This is why I say a lot of what people speculate when they say accidental lab leak ultimately adds back up to deliberate bioweapon, because the speculation ultimately arrives at the point where they say, well, this virus was clearly adapted to humans already, otherwise it wouldn't have spread, right? A worker wouldn't have gotten sick with it. So if we're talking about 2 different genetic lineages, that would suggest that it actually wasn't perfectly adapted, and simply we're talking about things that evolved in animals rather than people. And more evidence in favor of that would be the notion that one of these molecular features that I mentioned earlier on, the furin cleavage site, that one, which does make the virus more infectious, it was actually an incredibly suboptimal version of that feature that first emerged from the virus. And we know that because as we entered the variant era, we actually saw mutations in that feature of the virus that enhanced its activity, meaning the original version of it was kind of crappy and not optimal. And evolution itself, once the virus made its way around people, figured out the best combination of genetic code to make that feature way better than it was originally. So ultimately, the genetics were too different between these two lineages for it to have mutated in such a rapid time point. And lab leakers will actually tell you, like, the virus didn't really mutate all that much at the beginning of the pandemic, and they're not wrong on that. But that's contradictory from their perspective, because they can't explain away those two different lineages by saying, well, it actually mutated in the way I wanted it to mutate, so that there were two different lineages, but then it stopped. But then once we got variants, it started mutating again because, oh my God, it's a bioweapon. Like, the explanation there just becomes increasingly incoherent, and assumption after assumption after assumption just get piled on.
Yes, and we all love Occam's razor and should probably live by it.
Yeah, it's a pretty good adage, especially if we're actually having a science-based discussion with respect to evidence.
Yeah, I've found that a lot of people don't particularly care about having science-based conversations based on evidence, though.
Well, and that right there is the problem, is that people, these two papers that I talk about ad nauseum, they just ignore it. They pretend like it doesn't exist. It's actually one of my current favorite hobbies, is to just bring them up when people are arguing about this on Twitter, and it instantly short-circuits any lab leak discussion. Because I say, okay, what about the evidence in these papers? What have you considered any of this? And then that's usually when people start busting out the ad hominem and the insults. So it's worth noting that any good theory has to account for the totality of the available evidence, and lab leak does not do that.
Well,
awesome. Thanks for that.
Let me ask a question. You had said that they were tested. We know that China lies. We know they lie a lot. They're not. Probably not quite to the level of Russia, but it's the same game. And, no government's perfect, but China, really, misinformation is huge over there. How do we know? So who did the testing, and how do we know that the testing was done appropriately of the people who worked at that lab to say that they did not have the antibodies and had not been exposed?
Yeah, so this is where people are like very willing to just discard the evidence on the basis of China bad, because ultimately it was, I think, either the employees at the Wuhan Institute of Virology themselves, or by extension, like the Chinese CDC, that actually did this testing. Mm-hmm. But that's the thing is, for a lab leak to be like conclusively proven, you would need to pull a worker aside to see if they had ever been exposed. So even if they say, well, I don't trust any of that information, it came from the Chinese government, or, maybe they'll speculate, well, the Chinese government actually tested them and they were positive, and they're just not telling you that result because they don't want to be embarrassed or admit that it was their fault. So, that's an unfalsifiable claim, right? At the very least, saying we did a test and there were no antibodies, I'm sure those people in theory could do that test again, but it would not be the same quality of test, since we're now 3 years deep and maybe they were exposed since the pandemic had started. But all of that to say, it speaks to where people are coming at this from. If they're going to throw away that evidence on the basis of, well, it's coming from the Chinese, you can't trust anything they say, then this ultimately says you don't actually care about the science, you don't care about available evidence, you're just here to be mad at China. And that usually takes the discussion in an entirely different direction, right? If we're talking about that in good faith, yeah, you could say that is a weak point of that why lab leak is wrong discussion, because China is the one that did the testing. But at the same time, international scientists are not going to be able to show up and like, all right, everybody give me your blood now. Like that's a pretty wild demand to make of the people who work there and the Chinese government, to say, okay, we're here from the West, we're testing your blood. That's something you shouldn't expect to happen, because that would never actually occur. So go ahead.
Well, and we've had this discussion on the show before, which is it may end up then being a weak point in the argument against, but that does not make it a point in the argument for. So if you have somebody who is a hypochondriac, and they and a compulsive liar, let's add both to boot, and somebody comes up to you, says, hey, have you talked to Bob today, the hypochondriac compulsive liar? You say, no, I haven't. Well, do you know, does he have COVID? You say, no, I don't know. And buddy goes off, and then Bob comes up, and Bob says, oh my God, I've got COVID, I've got COVID, I've got COVID. And Bob runs off. And then your buddy comes back to you and says, oh, have you talked to Bob today? Oh, yeah, I just talked to him. Does he have COVID? Most people are actually going to say, nope, he doesn't have it. He does not have COVID. Why not? Well, because he said he does, and he's a liar, and he's a hypochondriac. But that's not how it works. When somebody is an unreliable source, that doesn't mean that the opposite of what they say is true. That just means what they claim as truth is not evidence. So your answer still has to be, I don't know if he's got COVID, because he lies about everything, and he's got hypochondria. But hypochondriacs, as it turns out, gets COVID at the same rate as everybody else. So unreliability is not evidence of the opposite of the claim. It's just evidence. It's just lack of evidence for what it is that's being posited. I've put that really badly. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, and that makes sense. Greg actually just reminded me, though. It was the WHO that actually tested the workers, but
that's what I had thought.
People are going to say, well, the WHO is controlled by China, and the goalposts will shift, and we're going to be right back in the same position where they're saying China's too involved and you can't trust it, which goes back to everything you just said.
Well, and it's entirely possible, and we've discussed this before too, because we've had on, and you were on, I think, to discuss conspiracy theories, and the rare conspiracy theory ends up eventually being true, but that's few and far between. 99% of them end up being false. And the problem is you end up having to move the goalposts so many times and say, well, if this happened, and add so many more contingencies to the chain, so that you're saying, well, if China owns the World Health Organization and can manipulate these people and so Occam's razor once again gets awfully burned. There's a comment from Sinister Porpoise, and I'd like to read a follow-up on Twitter. So Sinister Porpoise had said, and I think I may have, Schrodinger's bioweapon. It's both a bioweapon and non-existent at the same time. It does not become one or the other until it is, and I think she's typing out the other half of that, but there was a great follow-up on Twitter, very similar. This report from the woke FBI, who I deeply despise and don't trust, vindicates my views on the Wuhan virus entirely. China must be punished for leaking this virus that I've spent 3 years comparing to the common cold.
Yeah. I mean, what's your problem with that? Oh my God.
Oh dear Lord. So, all right. So, and then, so we hit. Let's see. I want to make sure. As Andrew, can you think of anything we missed? So, if you're willing to say that everybody who's done any research on this, now the science that we've been talking about too, I assume most of these studies have come from different universities across the U.S. and different countries. It's no one country that has just done the entirety of the work. Is that correct?
Yeah, if we're talking about these two studies, I mean, it's mostly like Western countries. So it's a lot of international virologists, immunologists, and scientists from Western countries. I mean, a decent chunk of them are from the U.S., but it's not only the U.S.
All right, so independent scientists who aren't working for the government, who have done this research on their own. There was a question. There's nothing I hate more than having a question that I cannot remember. Is there any other major element of this conspiracy theory that we have not hit? Oh, yes, I do have one more. You had said earlier that there is no evidence that they had this in the lab or any progenitor before this happened. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And I think you had said that they were actually publishing what they had. Isn't this a top secret bio lab?
Yeah, I mean that runs counter to the narrative that that's secret clandestine Chinese bioweapons testing, when the Wuhan Institute of Virology had absolutely published the genetic sequences of all the viruses that they had for many years prior to the pandemic. And where people start to add even more assumptions onto the pile is they say, well, the American government is funding the work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is true to a pretty decent extent. So therefore, the big virology industrial complex is trying to protect their funding streams, and they're hiding all of the secret progenitors actually, and they would have published this anyways because it was a bioweapon, which goes back to what I said before, that all of this lab leak stuff always adds back up to it was a clandestine bioweapons operation. So with respect to that, there have been new, more closely related coronaviruses found in bats in Laos, not even in China, but in Laos, in the Indo-Chinese peninsula, that are more closely related to the original version of COVID than anything the Wuhan Institute of Virology had in their stocks. So at that point in time, if they found even closer relatives in nature, it's a pretty safe thing to say that, look, we have published evidence that they found these viruses in nature. Here are the sequences. Here's where they collected everything. This is not something that was in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This goes back to the notion of precedent, that the bats that harbor these viruses live throughout the entire Indo-Chinese peninsula. They live pretty much everywhere, not only China, but pretty much everywhere in Southeast Asia. So this is not far-fetched to say. It's a pretty known, simple pathway from bat to animal to person that has historical precedent and a lot of evidence supporting it. And a lab leak doesn't account for the fact that viruses like this, including ones that are more closely related to the original version of COVID than anything the Wuhan Institute of Virology had, a lab leak doesn't account for that. So
in short, it sounds like what we're talking about is all the intelligence communities, including the ones that have said it's a leak, have said it was not a bioweapon and it was not deliberate because of the way China was completely unprepared for it, and both from what we could tell just by watching their response, but also the intelligence communities monitoring China from within. So it was not deliberate. It would have been accidental, and not a bioweapon. So in order for this to have been a leak, it would have to have been a leak of something that Wuhan had kept separate from a separate reserve from what they had made public, because they were making this work public. It is possible that they've got something that they haven't told anybody about. That's entirely, I wouldn't shock me, but it would have to be one of those things that they never released. Just coincidentally, sorry, when I say released, let me rephrase that. That they never, something that they never had published on. Disclosed. Thank you. That is the word. Something that they had never disclosed, that was inadvertently leaked, because there were two versions of it that were far enough apart that they couldn't have evolved in that 2-week period. You'd actually have to have two of these that would have been released separately. It would have had to have been that somebody was infected by it, because it's COVID. It doesn't last on the clothing very long. It doesn't last on surfaces very long. And it would somehow have to get from the lab to the market, infect people there twice with two different versions that had not been disclosed from the lab in the years prior during their work. And again, something that was being studied, not weaponized, so there have been no reason to not disclose it up until that point. Is that a fair overall assessment of what we're looking at?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. It's always funny just listing everything you just listed and then having to describe, how a worker would have to go to that market 2 separate times just for the singular purpose of spreading a virus. That I tell that story to people who are still on the lab leak train, and they never have any explanation as to why anybody would actually go do that. So, stacking everything like that, I think, shows you the broad nature of the evidence in favor of a natural origin and how ridiculous the assumptions are about a lab leak.
I have precluded Fox News from being able to clip any of this show. And the reason is because I know they're going to clip it and it's going to come out and it's going to say, well, that's it. Thank you for proving that it was a bioweapon engineered leak. made by Obama while he was in Kenya. We really appreciate your... I probably shouldn't have made that joke because I swear to God we're going to get demonetized just because they're going to like, oh, misinformation. You said Obama's from Kenya. Fucking... All right. I'm a little bitter. I'm a little bitter. Yeah, I know you're coming into YouTube. I would like to welcome you to the Brotherhood. I think you should come, but just like there's problems with Twitch, issues with YouTube. Decide you're going to be a news organization that's going to debunk something. Well, don't say what you're debunking, because then you're all of a sudden guilty of promulgating the thoughts. All right. So, any final thoughts before I think now I know that Greg had said one or two other things, and I think some of them went by a little quickly, so I did miss them. So I want to make sure we get any final thoughts from the live chat from 𝗍𝗛𝗻, and I don't think I have any other questions. And then barring that, I'd like 𝗍𝗻𝗻 to follow up, because he was the one who brought up the H5 last night. Was it last night or the night before? I think it was last night. So I'd like him to ask you about that. Yeah, clips are now making their of Nick are now making their rounds on 4chan again. Oh. So I don't have anything else. If anybody, again, last moments here. If anybody ooh, that's a really good question from Greg. And that's Greg, the peer review. We've talked about his channel before, and we will add a link to his channel in just a minute. And I think we'll put that in the description too, just so that people can find it. We love Greg and his work. It's what is it, 𝗧𝗛𝗲. So do we know any viruses that did leak from a lab?
Yeah, I mean, historically, I think what comes to mind is the Russian. I think it was a Russian flu lab. Like, it was 1977, 1978. This was actually in the Soviet Union, where people suggest that it came from a laboratory. They still have never been able to actually conclude it, but there's probably more evidence in favor of that notion than there is for anything actually coming out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology for SARS-CoV-2. So with that being said, you know, there's still speculation about that was the 1977 flu pandemic, whether that was due to like a flu virus research, or if they were actually trying to like test a vaccine, and somebody in the trial, you know, got deliberately infected with the flu to test the vaccine, and then it got out, and you know, that person spread it, and then it was off to the races. So historically, there are incidents like that are not going to really be all that conclusive. But I think it's also worth noting, if we're going to juxtapose what has historically happened with what is currently happening, biosafety technology and biosafety setups have never been better than they are now. Like, we have a much broader ability to keep laboratory workers safe from the things that they are working with for the sake of science and for the sake of knowledge and for the sake of pandemic prevention. Like, there are rules, regulations, pieces of technology, physical spaces, personal protective equipment, like all that has never been better than it is now, and people are heavily trained on what to do and how to protect themselves, so something like that doesn't happen. So I would say, because of that, the odds of something like this happening nowadays are a lot lower than it would have been historically in 1977.
And so
what you're saying is that as the farther we go, it's becoming Captain Trips scenario is becoming less and less likely.
Yeah, essentially.
From the Stand, in case people didn't know what Captain Trips was, the book The Stand is about a pandemic that wipes out most of humanity. So it's getting less and less likely, not more likely.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So there was I just tuned in. Did the coronavirus originate with Homozygoat? Yes or no? We think it's possible that Homozygoat probably engineered it with Barack Obama in Kenya, working with the Nancy Pelosi's husband's gay lover. That was our understanding. In time is not quite yet ready to declare that, but we're close. Our researchers are on that. I may just end up flipping a coin to decide whether or not that's the story we go with. I don't know yet. We'll see. Zandring and I are going to have Zandring and I take what we decide that we're gonna say we have high confidence in very seriously. We're gonna get a couple beers. We're going to talk about it, and then in the end, we're just going to flip a coin because fuck it, fine. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think this has been, all joking aside, I do think it's hard to say whether this is a serious issue or not. The reason we decided to do this show is because I think getting it as close to right as we can based on the available information is extraordinarily important. This appears, from where I'm sitting, to be being weaponized, which appears to be what you're seeing as well. It's possible it's not, but I'm seeing a lot of things. Again, the very nature of the fact that the head of the FBI would start at Fox News. Even Fox News knows that they're a joke, and they've said it with the recent releases that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. There's no way the head of the FBI, if he's serious about what he's trying to say, goes to Fox News, even if it's to say something that liberals are absolutely going to hate and conservatives are going to love. There are platforms to do it, and you're going to get taken seriously. Fox News isn't one of them. So, yeah, I think it's important to try to understand what's going on, and there's a lot, and it's a much ado about nothing. As you had said earlier, it doesn't seem like anything's changed, so why now? So thank you very much for coming on and taking the time to explain it to us. We really appreciate it. Now, as Zandring had, of course, pointed out, another doomsday scenario. So, as Zandring, I will kick that off to you.
So these balloons are actually UFOs from Alpha Centauri, and we apparently have been I'm sorry.
Could you go find that tunnel and drive right through that again? Just wherever that tunnel was. I think just okay.
Go right through it again. Well, I passed it. It's behind me a long ways. I'm assuming you've heard of the reports of the H5N1, a new strain of H5N1 popping up in a couple of different locations.
Yes, I wouldn't call it a new strain because the outbreak in birds has actually been ongoing since 2021, so it's not unknown per se. It's just more that it's newer to us because we haven't really been talking about it because we've had our minds preoccupied by a different virus. So
the article had just said a new strain, and I'm like, okay, well, but you also talked about detecting the strain in 2021. So I was just wondering how new of a strain it actually is. And influenza viruses are designated by two letters, two numbers, H5N1. H1N1 is really concerning to a lot of people. Is the H5N1 variant of the flu concerning to begin with to people?
Yes and no. I would say if we ever get sustained human-to-human transmission of it, it should be very concerning because in the 400-ish cases that have happened in the history of people, if we're talking about those cases in people due to H5N1, we're talking about a 56% fatality rate. So it will make COVID look like an actual cold by contrast because it is highly pathogenic, and that's why you'll see in media reports they'll abbreviate it HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza. It kills even more birds than that in the actual bird population. So ecologically, it's pretty devastating. But if it was ever to take off in people, we would have a pretty big problem with that 56% established fatality rate. Now,
Jesus.
With that being said, if we're talking about the H's and the N's, right? H5N1 is something that has been on the radar of governments. This is something that has been technically, there's a vaccine that exists for it already. So we're kind of ahead of the game-ish, but it's also worth noting that there's only about 20 million doses in the national stockpile for the U.S., meaning there's only currently vaccines available for 6% of the population, and that's going to go towards the rich, the politicians, and the well-connected before the average person is going to get a single dose. But it's also worth noting, too, exactly, government's going to prioritize themselves before anybody else. But with that being said, we're going to be in a position where those vaccines might not necessarily match the mutations that we might be seeing in this H5N1. So this is why like surveillance efforts are incredibly important. It's because we have to know exactly how that virus is mutating and use that information to try and retool vaccines if we need to ahead of time. And that's important because influenza viruses are some of the fastest mutating viruses that exist. Like the mutation rate of those things is incredibly high. So it's a possibility those vaccines might not necessarily help us in a potential human-to-human transmission scenario. So those are the reasons why people should be worried. But at the same time, right now, we have not seen any human-to-human transmission yet. And it is possible we might not ever see it as time goes on. But what makes it a possibility is that we keep seeing these one-offs because it's spread so much in birds, and now we might be seeing a mammal-to-mammal transmission in seals in South America, and we definitely saw it in minks in Spain. There was a mink colony in Spain that actually documented a mammal-to-mammal transmission of bird flu with mutations that would help it adapt to humans better, right? If it spreads in mammals, humans are mammals. So that's, if it adapts to mammals, it will become better at infecting us and increases the odds that we get that human-to-human transmission. But we haven't seen that right now. It might not ever happen. But the more it's allowed to spread freely, the higher the odds that something like that might happen. So that's don't worry right now. I think the average person doesn't have too much to worry about. Just don't hug and kiss dead birds, and I think you're okay. Maybe keep your pets away from dead birds if possible. That would be nice because it can infect your dogs and your cats. But beyond that, most of the responsibility at this point rests on governments to start developing vaccines as soon as possible.
It's always a delight to have you on.
Isn't it?
So what you're saying is I should stop my flock of zombie chickens that might pose a potential risk to me?
Yeah, I mean, you joke, but that's literally what just happened in Cambodia. A girl and her father both got a different strain of bird flu that was actually endemic to Cambodia, not the one that's causing all of the furor right now, but they got it from their stock of chickens and ducks in their backyard. So, yes, actually, no more zombie chickens.
No more zombie chickens. Now, on the positive side, though, it seems like we do have a pretty good handle on being able to make formulate vaccines for influenza. So, I mean, even if this strain does make that jump, it seems like we would have at least a leg up on getting, viable vaccines. Is that, am I correct in making that kind of assumption? We may have a significant issue if it does and really starts to take off. But
yeah, if it
we should be doing for coming up with vaccines for it.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, this is what the whole mRNA platform really excels at, is the rapid adaptability. But of course, COVID has kind of soured a lot of people on that for no valid reason. So it's possible that we get the production of these vaccines with sort of the typical like seasonal flu shot type of platforms, which are not mRNA based. But all that to say, like, we have a wide availability of technologies to do that. It technologically possible, and there's not really going to be any limitation there in terms of producing vaccines. It's uptake is going to be the problem if we need to actually engage in a vaccination campaign for H5N1. Right now, the people, or rather the entities that should be getting the vaccines, are factory farmed animals. So poultry and pig in particular are going to be the two most ideal candidates to vaccinate against bird flu, since those are the highest likelihood reservoirs that we could get that might facilitate that mammalian adaptation and spread.
And not only to protect the agriculture, but to keep them from being incubators that increase the likelihood of this mutating to something that could affect us. Is that? Yep. Roughly. All right.
That's exactly right.
All right. We have a $2 super chat from the peer review. Tell Marcus his 3-inch UTR is destabilizing his mRNA. Greg. First of all, I appreciate the super chat. But I find it slightly rude to talk about the length of somebody's UTR in public. What you discuss in private is your own business, but you don't need to. That's really just. We're going to talk about it. We're going to. I know you're still learning as a communicate. We'll talk. We'll talk. Thank
you. Gray, we can talk about it in private on Discord.
This is not your usual. This is not read and rap. I'm surprised. Oh, you're developing a troll army. Great.
Read and rap set the precedent. He's been recruiting people
successfully, from what I can tell. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you to the live chat. So here's the deal, folks. Tonight, in just what is it? I think at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. So that is in 3 hours from now, we're going to have on Commander Lance McMillan for downtime. It's downtime, so we're going to be chillaxing, but a lot's going on. So we're going to be talking, especially I think, a lot about what China's been doing with Ukraine, their involvement there, what's going on in Ukraine. Bakhmut looks like is going to fall at any time. We're going to be discussing those things. Tomorrow, the newly minted Captain Starsky is Captain Operator Starsky will be joining us 1 p.m. Eastern. He is the Ukrainian National Guardsman who has been reporting from Ukraine and filling us in on what's going on. We will be having him and Commander McMillan on once again tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show, we've had a number of super chats today. Thank you guys so much. That really does help. That's a huge help. Another way to help, like, subscribe, and as Andring is always beating me over the head and reminding me, and he's right to do so, I actually appreciate it, share. I hope this has been informational. I think we covered all the bases, and I do think that this was an important thing to discuss once. I hope we don't have to do it again. But so I'd very much like to thank Homozygoat for coming, and if you like it, and if you felt this was informative, and if you think there's somebody else who could listen to this and learn from it, and maybe feels like we've covered those bases, share. It really helps us out if you share, so please do that. Thank you to all of our supporters. Thank you to those in the live chat. Andring, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming, and Homozygoat, once again, thank you to you as well for coming. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so we will be seeing you guys later tonight in about 3 hours, and then tomorrow. And in the meantime, stay safe. I can't wait to see who's going to come out next. And I think the other thing that we do need to discuss, and I don't know if it's going to be McMillan or if we're going to get somebody else on, is why would the U.S. State Department and or government be starting to do some of these sabotage things again? We'll get into it, but until then, I think we've covered it. Thank you all. Have a good evening.